a brief word about some upcoming events. Tomorrow we have an all-day workshop, a Title VIII workshop entitled Engaging the Law in Eurasia and Eastern Europe. All the details are on our website, but we will have a large group of young scholars devoted to legal studies, including our speaker today, who will be making a second appearance. We'll be discussing such topics as crime, corruption, commercial law, human rights, property rights, Russian imperial legal history, and Soviet legal history. So it should be a real feast for those of you who are interested in Russian law and Russian legal history. Next Monday, Steve Harris will be here for a noontime discussion from 12 to 1. Tomorrow's event, by the way, goes from 9:30 to 4:15. Next Monday, May 20th, we will have Steve Harris, as I said. He will be talking about communism on Tomorrow Street, mass housing, and everyday life after Stalin. And then the following Tuesday, on May 28th, we will have Sayul Satayeva here. She is a Fulbright Scholar at American University and Vice Director of the Kazakhstan Central State Archive of Cinema and Photography. And she will be talking about various travelers through Kazakhstan, including George Kennan the Elder and George Frost. Well, today it's our great pleasure to have Lauren McCarthy here. She is a Title VIII scholar and doing research on a variety of different legal issues. She currently is an assistant professor at in the Department of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She did her PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, undergraduate degree at Wesleyan University. In addition to her current job at the University of Massachusetts, she has a variety of other different affiliations. She is a research fellow at the Higher School of Economics. She is an associate at the Davis Center at Harvard University, as well as a consultant at the International Organization for Migration in Azerbaijan. It is our great pleasure to have Lauren today to talk about her dissertation research that she's busy turning into a book, and she'll be talking about enforcing laws on human trafficking in Russia. Lauren?
Thank you very much, Will, and thanks everyone for coming today. This is a really great opportunity for me to speak about an ongoing research project, and as Will mentioned, this is my dissertation research, which is being turned into a book, which means that I'm really, really deep in it right now, and so I'm going to try to limit myself to the 35 minutes that Will is giving me. So this research is based on time that I spent in the field in Russia for about a year doing interviews and participant observation, as well as ongoing data collection on trafficking cases that have been registered and opened by the Russian law enforcement agencies. And so the general outline of the talk is that I'll talk a little bit about the kinds of trafficking found in Russia today, just to give an overview of the issue. And then I'll talk a little bit in depth about the difficulties that law enforcement has faced in prosecuting human trafficking in Russia. I will end on an optimistic note, which is to show how, despite a lot of these difficulties, Russian law enforcement is prosecuting trafficking, but in ways that are more convenient to them, albeit not using the trafficking laws. So this is sort of trafficking ends up being a case study for a much larger phenomenon, which is how Russian law enforcement learns to use new laws, how they deal with new legal concepts, and how they learn to adapt. And this has pretty serious implications for how Russian law enforcement deals with ongoing problems, new problems, things like extremism, money laundering, organized crime, terrorism. These are all complex cases that are very similar in the way that they work to human trafficking. In addition, this also gives us a sense of some of the difficulties that law enforcement faces worldwide in dealing with human trafficking. So this is not just a Russia problem, this is a problem that law enforcement has elsewhere as well. All right, so I'm just gonna give a quick overview of the kinds of human trafficking that we find in Russia today. It's very difficult to have any kind of concrete numbers on this phenomenon. I call it the we don't have a denominator problem. But this is something that's illicit. Obviously, people are not advertising it, they're trying to hide it. And so it's very difficult to know what the raw numbers of people who are trafficked into and out of and within Russia are. But there are a couple of clear types of trafficking. For sex trafficking, we have both international and domestic manifestations. Internationally, women are taken out of Russia from Russia into Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and sometimes as far as North America. These are generally very sophisticated trafficking operations, and they traffic their victims into prostitution and occasionally into pornography. There are also women that are trafficked into Russia internationally, and there have been cases from Central Asia and from some of the other former Soviet republics. Domestically, though, women and girls are trafficked primarily for prostitution within Russia. And the traffickers are generally from low-level organized crime groups, a lot of local type groups, small groups, not very sophisticated. And they tend to target women who are from broken homes where people won't really be looking for them if they were to disappear. So they would already be prone to running away. And even if their parents do report them missing, which they often don't, law enforcement is not generally going to look for them immediately. These are also women that come from small villages and are taken to larger population centers. The second primary type of trafficking in Russia is labor trafficking. And this is also both internal and international. So men are trafficked into Russia from Central Asia, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, as well as from Moldova and Belarus. There have been some reports of men trafficked in from China and also from North Korea. Within Russia, though, there's a population of people who are extremely vulnerable to trafficking, and these are homeless, alcoholic, or drug addicts, people who are very much at the margins of society. And both the international and domestic manifestations of labor trafficking, people, mostly men, end up in agriculture, in salvage operations, in factories, domestic labor, construction. They're mostly sectors that are already working a lot in the informal economy. And then finally, the final type of trafficking that is really prevalent in Russia today is child trafficking. And this is not adoption, right? So I want to make a very, very clear distinction. This is adoption that is completely outside of normal channels. It's not where you go through an adoption agency. This is one person looking for someone to buy their baby. Very, very much a sale of a child that is totally outside of regular channels. So I want to make sure I distinguish that from the ongoing controversies over adoption that have happened over the past several months. Russian law enforcement has not been very successful at dealing with trafficking. This is a set of statistics from the MVD from 2004 to 2011. I don't yet have the 2012 statistics. These are cases that are registered in the criminal justice system. This doesn't mean that they're all going to move forward as trafficking cases, and in fact, very few of them do. In a debate on amendments to the trafficking law in 2008, the MVD reported that only 9 of the cases that they had registered had actually made it all the way through the investigation process and made it to court as trafficking, and under the trafficking statutes. And what this also doesn't tell us is very much about what kinds of cases they're pursuing, the kinds of strategies that they're using to learn to deal with this phenomenon and these new laws. And so that's really where my research comes in. A little bit of background before we get into the nitty-gritty of what I've done here. The Russian Federation has legal obligations, both domestically and internationally. In 2000, they joined 117 other countries to sign the Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children, which most people prefer to call the Palermo Protocol because it's otherwise a really big mouthful. This was part of the Transnational Organized Crime Convention and was an optional protocol that many countries signed on to. This protocol, along with the Transnational Organized Crime Convention, went into effect in 2003, and right about that same time, Russia passed a domestic law criminalizing human trafficking and the use of slave labor, and these are 2 separate statutes. At the same time that they passed these new laws that criminalized these behaviors and these activities, they also changed the scope of the laws on prostitution, primarily recruitment into prostitution and organizing prostitution, which made those crimes which made human trafficking easier to prosecute as a prostitution case if it was indeed related to prostitution. So that has actually played an important role in how law enforcement has ended up dealing with human trafficking. So This is a lot of text, but I just want to highlight a couple of things. These are the criminal code definitions of human trafficking and the use of slave labor. And in particular, I'd like to highlight the two different ways in which you can have a human trafficking case according to the law. So the purchase and sale of a human being, any transaction with respect to a human being, is one way that law enforcement can show that there's been a trafficking situation. So this is a buying or selling with the object of sale being a human. Similarly, his recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receiving for the purpose of exploitation. And to show this, you would have to show that one of those activities has taken place with the purpose of exploitation. And these have ended up being two sort of very different ways that law enforcement has pursued trafficking cases under the same law. The use of slave labor statute, using the labor of a person in respect to which authority is exercised, which is akin to ownership, where the person cannot refuse to carry out the work or services for reasons that independent of him. There hasn't been as much use of this second statute, but I think it's important that we sort of know how the law defines these issues. Okay, so as part of this research, I have been tracking cases through the Russian news media from their initial registration or sort of the time that they first come into the media sphere through the end of the case, whether that's they just stop writing about it or that somebody is convicted. I've been tracking all of those cases. It gets very confusing here. And I've gone through about 4,000 plus newspaper articles so far to put this database together. And so this following chart is an ongoing, these are not my final numbers because this is an ongoing process, but this is this gives us a sense of the kinds of trafficking cases that law enforcement is pursuing. So this is not the official MVD data. It's not the Russian MVD's data. This is my own data that I've collected. And again, these numbers are not yet final. My research assistant and I are still sort of dutifully filtering through all of the articles alphabetically by region. And so right now we're on Rostov. And so anything that has been registered in anything alphabetically after Rostov is not yet reflected in this data. But I think there's a couple of very interesting things here. So almost 70% of the cases that law enforcement is pursuing are domestic cases. This is domestic sex trafficking and domestic labor trafficking. And that really contrasts to, I think, what we generally think of when we think of Russia as a trafficking country. We generally think of people being trafficked out. And while these numbers do not reflect the prevalence of cases overall, again, this is we don't have a denominator problem. I think it's really astounding that the way that law enforcement has conceptualized this crime has generally been in a domestic way, or has at least pursued it in a domestic way. And we can talk more about why that might be the case in the question and answer if you're interested. What my numbers also don't tell us, just to add one more caveat here, is how many of the cases that are charged as trafficking will actually end up being prosecuted as trafficking, or whether the people who are suspects in those cases will actually be convicted of trafficking. And obviously, for how long they'll be convicted, we can't tell that here, but I do have that data as well. So given this, I'd like to turn now towards talking a little bit about some of the problems that law enforcement faces when they are dealing with trafficking cases. So there's three major problems, and these are the problems that have to do with trafficking itself as a crime and actually investigating trafficking cases. So the first is uncovering the case, and I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this other than to say that law enforcement is generally reactive, and this is true in any country in the world. So they need information in order to start pursuing some kind of investigation. Trafficking is a crime that has victims who are often ashamed, embarrassed, afraid of threats from their traffickers or from law enforcement. And so very few trafficking victims are really gung-ho about going to the police to talk to them about what has happened to them. And so this is the actual uncovering of the case can be very challenging for law enforcement because they just don't have the information to start the investigation. But if they do get the information, identifying the case as trafficking is also very difficult. And I'll talk a little bit about both the formal and informal criteria that they've ended up using to try to figure this out. And then finally, gathering appropriate evidence to prosecute a case. This is something that law enforcement has to do everywhere. They have to prove the elements of the crime, and that has also been very challenging for Russian law enforcement. This is sort of the first element of the things that make trafficking cases difficult to prosecute, but these are also compounded by the setup and incentive structure of Russian law enforcement institutions, which I will get to as soon as I talk about trafficking cases themselves. So, identifying the case as trafficking. So if you break it down, this is what the trafficking law looks like. You can prove that a purchase or sale has taken place. And for those of you who read Russian, all the Russian stuff is up here as well, in case you're interested in how they conceptualize trafficking. So you can prove that the purchase and sale has taken place. Now, originally, as the law was formulated, it seemed to law enforcement that the buying and selling, the purchase and sale, had to eventually then be related to the exploitative purpose, prostitution, forced labor, whatever it was. That has changed since 2008, and now if you can prove that the transaction took place, you have a case. For the other way of proving trafficking, it's much more complicated. So trafficking is a process, and so depending on where you encounter that process, you may see a whole host of different crimes. So if you're a law enforcement agent and you encounter it at the point of recruitment, you might see recruitment into prostitution, you might see false advertising, you might see a number of things that are also crimes. And your first instinct as a law enforcement agent would probably be to just charge that crime, what you see. If you encounter it somewhere in the middle, before the exploitation takes place, you may be encountering illegal border crossing, you may be encountering kidnapping, you may encounter false imprisonment. All of those are crimes in the Russian criminal code, and it makes sense for a law enforcement agent to stop there. If you encounter the crime at the exploitation phase, similarly, you might see prostitution, you might see assault, you might see rape, you might see some other kind of problem. It's only if you step back as a law enforcement agent and see that this is an entire process might you realize that it's human trafficking and not one of those individual crimes that are within the criminal code. So this has actually been quite challenging for law enforcement because they are looking for individual things that happen at particular points in time. That's why the buying and selling actually has been very helpful for them in terms of figuring out what trafficking looks like. So there are also a number of informal criteria because law enforcement agents throughout the world do not just look at the text of the law to try to figure out how to apply the law. And these informal criteria have come from sort of societal representations of what trafficking looks like, their own ideas of what slavery might look like. And so there have been three sort of major stereotypes that get applied to trafficking cases to figure out if this is a real trafficking case with a real victim. A real trafficking case in many law enforcement agents' minds will be a situation in which the person has no ability to escape. And the truth is that that is very rarely the case. There are not that many trafficking cases where people are chained up, where they're guarded by dogs, where they're constantly monitored, where they're constantly watched and followed. They have no freedom of movement. Traffickers are very smart. They use other forms of control. They use the threat of physical reprisal, the threat to victims' families. They use the taking away of their documents. They use what's called debt bondage, saying you owe us for some portion of the trip that you took. And so a lot of times victims of trafficking will stay in their trafficking situation despite having a technical ability to escape. They don't believe that they have the ability to escape, but to an outside law enforcement, if you're not chained up or walled off from the rest of the world, then why didn't you go for help? And this is something that law enforcement has brought up over and over again, or has come up over and over again in trafficking cases. Another informal criteria is the level of voluntariness that the victim displayed in getting into the trafficking situation. And though according to international law that Russia has signed on to, the consent to the exploitation does not count if the exploitation, if the situation ends up being exploitation. So if you consented to be a prostitute and were taken abroad and you were then exploited, not paid, forced into a situation that you weren't expecting, that is not supposed to matter in law enforcement's assessment of whether or not this is trafficking. That is not what happens in reality. In reality, if law enforcement thinks that she knew what she was getting into, and she should have known what she was getting into, and any idiot would know that they were getting into this situation, they will often not pursue those cases as trafficking because they are positive that this is not a crime, that there was some complicity by the victim. And so this has been an issue. This is also an issue in labor trafficking cases. If the men agreed to work in these conditions, well, how is this exploitation? And that happens a lot in these cases. And then finally, compensation. So if the victims are paid at all, law enforcement will often not conceptualize it as trafficking. In other words, their informal criteria very closely correspond to sort of traditional ideas of what slavery is. And if they don't see those markers, they are unlikely to see this as a case of trafficking or use of slave labor. And this appears over and over again in the research that I've done. So there's both this informal and formal aspect to how they decide to pursue trafficking cases as trafficking. The final issue is gathering evidence. Trafficking is a brand new law. New laws don't come with instruction manuals, and so there's no way to know if you gather this piece of evidence, this piece of evidence, and this piece of evidence, this will be convincing to a judge, and they will convict this person of trafficking. And this is also something that I heard over and over in my interviews when I was in Russia. The real problem is that the evidence required is unpredictable. There's no common formula for what works because nothing is outlined. And then similarly with murder, we know what expert analyses to order and how to prove the case, but with human trafficking, it's a lot harder. And over time, of course, law enforcement has learned what kinds of evidence are generally going to work and what kinds of evidence are not going to work. So the evidence of a purchase or sale, if you can video document that, if you can go undercover and actually do a buy and bust operation, then that is really convincing evidence. Second to that, victim testimony about whether or not there has been exploitation has also been very important. But if you have only that, that's generally not going to be enough to get you the case or the conviction if you're a law enforcement agent. And so also documentary and other kinds of physical evidence have become sort of the gold standard for being able to prosecute these cases. But in the first 10 years of this law being on the books, this really was very complicated. Law enforcement did not really understand or know what was going to be enough evidence or what was going to be the right evidence if they were to bring forward a trafficking case. And as I'll talk a little bit more about now, the uncertainty is very, very dangerous for Russian law enforcement. They are assessed on very, very clear metrics. And if their numbers get messed up in any way, they can be subject to disciplinary action. So all of this uncertainty is something that they're very concerned about and very attuned to. So perhaps more important than talking about how difficult trafficking cases are, I think for explaining why Russian law enforcement has had such a difficult time with trafficking cases and other cases more generally, it makes sense to talk about the kinds of institutional incentives that they face in their day-to-day work. And this is not only related to trafficking, this is a much more general phenomenon. The most important factor influencing the behavior of law enforcement in this system is what is called the Palichная система. This is otherwise known as the quota system, the stick system, the tag system. Basically, it is a carryover from the Soviet period that assesses all law enforcement action based on metrics of their activities that they've completed. So cases cleared, citations written, searches performed, people arrested, all of these things get documented and then aggregated up the hierarchy of law enforcement. So there's a lot of pressure from their superiors also to make sure that those statistics look good because they are aggregated up. This leads at best to sort of collusion to lower the effectiveness of the criminal justice system, and at worst, manipulation and falsification of statistics. So the three major things that law enforcement cares about is their statistics on cases cleared, and this leads them to assess right at the very outset, what is the likelihood that this case is going to be cleared? If they don't think it's going to be cleared, which essentially means that they've solved it and found a person that they can put the case on, that's somebody who is going to be the accused, they are not going to pursue it. They will do everything in their power not to register it officially. They will do everything in their power to try to not investigate it because they don't want to mess up their statistics. The second thing that also matters a lot to law enforcement is how the statistics are presented. They're always compared to the numbers of the previous year. Unsurprisingly, there is always pressure for that number to go up, not down, and therefore it doesn't often reflect the actual situation on the ground, especially with a crime like trafficking, which you don't actually run across that often in comparison to other kinds of crime. So it's all well and good to expect that the number of cases cleared for theft might rise over time as law enforcement gets better at it, but with trafficking, it's not that often that they encounter it. So expecting this number to go up year after year can be a real disincentive to pursuing a trafficking case. And then finally, time limits. The Criminal Procedure Code lays down very, very strict time limits for how long each particular stage of an investigation can take. The investigation, once officially opened, should be completed within 2 months. As you saw with my whole system with the, with the circles and the law, this is a really complicated crime, and 2 months is generally not enough. And so what they end up doing, as I'll talk about a little bit more later, is that they end up using other laws, some of those sort of sub-laws that they can find cases in and be able to clear them much more quickly. If you go beyond the 2 months as a law enforcement agent, you have to go up the hierarchy to ask for permission. And if you go up the hierarchy to ask for permission, then they're looking at you, and you don't want them looking at you. You want to be kind of doing your own thing and not under the eye of the hierarchy. So just to give you a sense of what this looks like, I just pulled this off one of the many, many, many forms that law enforcement has to fill out. So for every case, for every statute in the criminal code, they have to show where that case came from and what happened to it. And so once a case is officially in the system, it becomes very clear exactly where the failure happened. So if it gets to the prosecutor and it doesn't go forward, then there's some question about what happened. And this all ends up leading back to the initial people opening the case, trying to figure out what the prospects are for moving that case all the way through the system successfully. And this is a huge disincentive to pursuing a trafficking case because they are complicated and there is so much uncertainty. The institutional structure, which I'll talk just about briefly, Russian law enforcement is extremely hierarchical. And I already mentioned that all of these numbers get aggregated up the chain. There's also a lot of pressure from above not to go outside of the chain of command. There's very little, and initiative is not rewarded. And so Russian law enforcement are very hesitant to do anything that's not sort of established procedure. There's also a very strong division of functions across different law enforcement agencies. And of course, what everybody thinks of when we think about Russian law enforcement is there is somewhat of an institutional culture of corruption, and this plays a role in a number of different ways. But just to give you a sense, before I wrap up, of the division of functions. A trafficking case, it is possible for a trafficking case to go through 5 different people in the criminal justice system before it actually reaches the courtroom. All of these people are looking out for their own interests. They're looking out for their own statistical clearance rates, and they each have different roles in that process, and they each have different ways that that statistical clearance rate might affect them. So the first people that encounter a trafficking case are usually the operative agents, operativniki. They are on the ground, they're gathering initial evidence, they're kind of trying to put together all the stuff that they're eventually going to pass on to the investigator. For what I call simple trafficking without any aggravating factors, that would go to an investigator in the police. For more complex cases of trafficking, it would go to an investigator in the investigative committee. If it goes to the police at first and then is found to be more complicated, it gets traded up to the investigative committee. Once the investigator puts together the case file, which is essentially taking all of the stuff that the operative agents bring in and making them look pretty according to the requirements of the Criminal Procedure Code, put together the case file, that goes to a prosecutor who has to approve the charge in the indictment document. And then if that happens, it goes to a courtroom prosecutor who will take it before the court. Now, each person in this chain has an incentive for their numbers to look good and has an incentive not to take on a case that has any uncertainty of outcome. And so each of these people are empowered both to sort of say, we don't want this case. They're also empowered to change the charge that the case is going forward with. And that is generally what happens in human trafficking prosecutions. In Russia, very few of them end up in court under a human trafficking charge because there are other statutes that they can use that will be quicker, that will be easier, that they have experience with, and that don't actually have that great of a difference in terms of the sentencing outcomes. So just to give you a sense, these are from quotes from my interviews. About half the cases prosecuted under 240, which is the recruitment into prostitution statute, are also Article 127(1)(2). That's the human trafficking statute. We can either do 10 cases under 240 or 1 case under 127(1), so we choose more cases. 240 is only a little less harsh. It's not a big difference in the sanctions, so why try harder? I think that basically sums up my entire argument in one quote. It's the best quote in my entire research. Similarly, another police officer, we've had no cases under Article 127.1. We usually begin investigations under Article 240 just in case, which is why we don't use Article 127.1. And this all goes back to the incentive structure, right? You want to get these cases off your desk as quickly as possible. If you have a pretty sure conviction that you think you're going to be able to get under an alternative statute, there's no incentive for you to work harder to prosecute the human trafficking case. And I think this is most clearly demonstrated by looking at the change in the number of prostitution cases registered that occurred right after the human trafficking laws were passed. In 2003, the human trafficking laws were passed. In 2004, you have almost between 200% and 300% jump in the number of prostitution cases. And as I mentioned before, this happens for 2 reasons. One, there is an emphasis on trafficking and that Russian law enforcement has to do something about trafficking. But there's also an easing of the requirements to be able to use prostitution laws to prosecute human traffickers. And so that has actually been a marriage of convenience in a lot of ways. The incentives lead you to take the easier case anyway. In addition, the easing up of the way that you can use these articles on prostitution ends up enabling law enforcement to use them much more effectively to prosecute human traffickers. So the great irony of the whole thing is that Russia passes a law on human trafficking and then law enforcement doesn't use it because they're using a different law to actually prosecute traffickers. And that is the take-home story of the Russian law enforcement's pursuit of human trafficking cases, I would say. How did I do? Perfect.
Right.
All right. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Lauren. My first question would be, you talk about that alternative laws exist in prostitution and sex trafficking. Do similar alternative laws exist for labor trafficking? And do they get around these types of issues as well for labor trafficking cases?
Yes, absolutely. It's a little bit harder to track because the overlap in so the alternative laws for labor trafficking are generally false imprisonment, kidnapping, and occasionally like labor violations, but those aren't really going to be criminal violations. So it's mostly forced labor, it's mostly false imprisonment. The problem is that there's a lot of other situations in which kidnapping or false imprisonment might happen. So it's very hard to look at the numbers for false imprisonment or kidnapping to be able to say convincingly, like, oh, look, they're using all of these statutes for trafficking. Whereas the overlap between the prostitution articles and the human trafficking statute is so clear. And in terms of the international definition of what trafficking is, it's a lot easier to make that direct comparison. But absolutely, I have plenty of cases that I've looked at where the description is a human trafficking case, but yet they're being prosecuted under false imprisonment.
Okay, great. Floor to questions. Thomas?
My name's Thomas Grindley. You mentioned illegal child adoption. It's well known that Russia has recently limited the adoption of children from Russia to the US. Has this had any impact on the amount of illegal adoption? Could you give some idea of the extent of legal adoption in Russia? And does it involve any monetary transfer?
So that's a great question. I think it's too soon to tell, actually, whether or not the limitations on international adoption are going to have any impact on illegal adoption. From what I have done research on with the child trafficking cases for the purposes of adoption, these have generally been domestic. Parents who cannot have children. And most of the cases that I've looked at have actually been stopped by law enforcement before the transaction took place. So there is almost always a monetary transaction, to answer the second part of your question. But oftentimes law enforcement gets word of it that somebody is looking to sell their baby and will actually step in and pose as the buyer. And as soon as the money changes hands, they will arrest the person for selling the baby. It's very rare that they're actually catching the purchaser of the baby. Usually it's only the seller. Although before they were sure that buying and selling of a human could stand on its own as a criminal offense, they actually did a whole host of very creative things because they wanted to be able to prosecute child traffickers. And what they were confused about was whether or not buying and selling had to be related to the purpose of exploitation. And when they thought that it did have to be related to that purpose, what they would do is they would go in as a potential buyer of a child, and they would say, because they had to establish the purpose of exploitation as part of the criminal law, so they would say, we would like to buy your baby. We're going to use it for organ transplant for my child. And as soon as the organ transplant comes in, that's a form of exploitation. Or we're going to buy your baby. We're going to use it for begging. We're going to buy your daughter. When she grows up a little, we're going to sell her for prostitution. And when that happened and the undercover agent said that to the seller didn't flinch and was like, oh, no, I'll keep the baby. Then they would bust them. That has largely stopped happening post-2008 amendments that establish buying and selling of a human could be a crime on its own. So there is always a monetary transaction. It's just that there's not a lot of outside. They're not usually filming the monetary transaction without it being an undercover agent that's actually doing the purchase.
John.
I'm really intrigued by your interviews. I wondered how many you had and how did you get access for them?
So it's a great question. I took out the data slide. The way I got access, I think I'll start there, is I embedded myself in the International Organization for Migration's project on human trafficking that had a law enforcement arm. And so I did a lot of travel with them to conferences, and I was able to speak to a lot of law enforcement agencies through conferences on human trafficking. I also traveled around to 8 different regions in Russia with pre-existing contacts that I had there, and they were able to set up interviews for me with various prosecutors and police officers. I also did a lot with work with the U.S. Embassy when the embassy was doing a lot of programming on trafficking and also sponsoring conferences. And so again, I attended those, and I had a lot of conversations with law enforcement on the sides of conferences that were devoted to trafficking. I tried the cold call approach. It did not work. So I ended up doing this much more sort of embedded research. And in total, I probably talked to somewhere around 50 law enforcement agents, prosecutors, police officers, academics who were in the MVD academies. And those were, sort of varying levels of depth of interviews. I also talked a lot to NGOs who had worked with law enforcement agents doing trainings. So I feel like I managed to triangulate a lot of the things. But there were some really great quotes from law enforcement agents that I got throughout the interview process that were really enlightening to really help figure out what was going on.
Yeah, I'd really like to hear a bit more about which regions you were in and a little bit about your reception when you spoke to law enforcement. And also, back when I started doing this about 13 years ago, they were actually setting up, units, or they said they were, special units on human trafficking. And again, this was right after the protocol and everything, and probably a blip in the radar screen before everything soured again. But I'd just be curious as to your impression now that you've done it so recently, how you would compare the regions. Are some working harder? Are some less so? And where do you see most of the victims, et cetera? Any insight on that?
Yeah, so this would be a lot easier to answer if my data collection were complete, but it's not, and we're stuck at Rostov. I think in terms of my own research, I went to 8 different regions. I was based primarily in Moscow. I went to the Far East, to both Khabarovsk and Primorsky Krai. I went to Saratov. I went to Stavropol twice. I went to Kazan. I went to Yoshkar-Ola in Mariel. I went to, is that all the places I went? It was a real smattering of places, and some of it was just sort of, I had found out that there were trafficking cases, so I just went because I knew somebody there. And others, I went to the Far East, obviously, because they had done the most trafficking prosecutions at the time. I think that is changing. And I think that the insight that I can give on the regions without having the full data is that it seems to me that regions have a really hard time with the first case. There's not a lot of information sharing across the regions. When they have the first case, other cases will follow. And that's something that I want to look more closely at when I have the full data set. There's been a lot of prosecutions that I was very surprised in the South, just not that there were cases in the South, but that there have been a lot of prosecutions, a lot of slave labor prosecutions in the South near the border, like Astrakhan, Rostov, Krasnodar. Those are areas that are doing quite a bit. And they tend to mimic previous prosecutions. And so there were 2 cases in Yoshkar-Ola in Mariel where they basically had, and I have a lot of court documents from these cases, that they were basically the same investigation. They were just different names and the same number of witnesses and the prosecutor told me afterwards that she was very upset that though she had won the case, they did not have the same sentence as the previous group that had been, doing basically the exact same thing, and she was going to appeal based on that. So there is, once practice is established, it continues. I think it's that first case that's really difficult. And to answer the question about units on human trafficking, this has gone back and forth. So at first there is a federal level unit in the MVD. But it is not just trafficking. It's trafficking, it's slave labor, it's pornography, it's prostitution, it's all of these things put together. So it's a huge, huge thing, and there's one person that is doing it at the federal level. So that's a little overwhelming. In terms of the units, there were various units in the I'm trying to remember the acronym. It's one of those really long Russian law enforcement acronyms. In the organized crime, the specialized organized crime, DBOPIT, that it was, but that has since been disbanded. And so those people either went into the extremism units or the economic crime units, or back into the general pool of criminal investigative units. And I think trafficking prosecutions have suffered because that was previously an elite unit that was tasked with a particular set of things. It was kidnapping, it was organized crime, it was trafficking. And so there was some pride in doing that kind of work. And I think that has, though it's not really clear to me yet sort of how that has affected everything, interviews that I've conducted suggest that it hasn't been as much of a priority since then. Although the MVD is all about trafficking, like in the past 6 months. So I'm not really sure. We might be entering a new era.
You talked about at the beginning that you find out about these cases by monitoring the media. I was just curious if you could actually give some descriptions of how the media reports on these cases. Are they kind of sensationalized page one? Are they buried in the back pages? And do they continue to follow them, as it were, in order to keep some sort of indirect pressure on law enforcement?
I wouldn't say they follow them to keep indirect pressure on law enforcement, but I would say some cases they do. The big splashy cases they do. So there was just a case recently in Moscow. In a store, there were some Central Asian women who had been there for like 10 years. They had been exploited. It's strange actually, because there's so many situations like this throughout Russia, but this was a huge splash. There were a lot of NGOs in there that were trying to rescue them. The MVD, the FMS, the Migration Service, was trying to deport them. That people were trying to get a case opened under the slave labor cases. And so that kind of splashiness can create pressure. They ended up being deported and no case was opened. But with the media monitoring, what I've done, some of them are sensationalized. Komsomolskaya Pravda does great reporting on human trafficking cases, but it's always sensationalized. But they do interviews, they talk to law enforcement, they have really good coverage. What I do for the media monitoring is I have the equivalent of a Google alert, which is a Yandex alert, come to my inbox every day, 5 different terms that connote human trafficking. I then go through all the articles that come through, I categorize them based on cases, I put them all together, all the articles on one particular case together, and I follow that. And a lot of them are pursued. Law enforcement is pretty proud when they open a trafficking case. They almost always have a press release. It's buried on their local law enforcement page. It's not necessarily trumpeted, but the RUNET is actually quite expansive, and so you do get local reports. And these, I have some regional statistics from the MVD. And I've compared those with the stuff that I have in the database, and they've actually lined up pretty well.
The Russians really like detective novels, and there are a lot of them out there. I don't know the field that well, but does that genre provide any insights to your study?
No. I mean, so I don't know the genre as well as I probably could, but I think the detective novels are generally fairly heroic. And I think that they don't deal with a lot of these internal workings of law enforcement that really make law enforcement hesitant to use laws. So they don't detective novels almost never deal with the Palichная система, the quota system. They don't deal with this really strict institutional hierarchy that makes law enforcement really afraid to step outside the chain of command. And so they're great for procedural stuff. So like you kind of learn exactly how cases make their way through the system. But in terms of the things that actually motivate law enforcement behavior, I haven't seen very many examples of real honest discussion in those kinds of novels about what is making law enforcement tick.
Kelly Smith, Georgetown. You mentioned that this kind of learning curve that has to take place can carry over to other laws as well. Did you get the impression from your law enforcement people that they were feeling overwhelmed? Is there a steady flow of new things like this that are very difficult for them to cope with, or does trafficking stand out?
I think that's a great question. I think that no, trafficking doesn't stand out. I think if you take the extremism law, you're looking at exactly the same set of situations and processes. We like the outcome of this using different laws to prosecute trafficking, because we put bad guys in jail, and we're like, yay, traffickers are going in jail. It doesn't matter what laws they use. When we start looking at the extremism law, though, and they're using similar things to put people they don't like in jail, we're a little bit more skeptical about this kind of, what does this mean for the rule of law more generally? So there are a lot of vague laws that are sort of similarly vague that are process oriented, and these are newer laws. Money laundering is another example. Organized crime is another example. Law enforcement in Russia is very good at dealing with crimes that happen at a particular point, at a particular place. They are not very good at dealing with processes. And any of the kinds of, especially the transnational organized crime activities, are going to be much more process-oriented than sort of point-oriented. And I think this is going to be a real challenge for Russian law enforcement, and it's not just about trafficking.
Right here.
Svetlana Shatalova, Russian Embassy. The State Department is preparing a special report on human trafficking in the world every year. You said that you collaborated with the U.S. Embassy. Are you somehow involved in this work? Because this is the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, which is preparing the Russian part for this report. If not, what is your opinion? Are you familiar with this report, the part concerning Russia, and what do you think about it? Thank you.
I am not involved at all in the compilation of the TIP report. When I was working with the embassy, I was working with their law enforcement section. They were doing conferences on trafficking, but other parts of the embassy are putting together the trafficking in persons report. I think that generally speaking, the trafficking in persons report has its place. I think it has done a lot to bring attention to the problem throughout the world. I also I think it's been a very difficult point of contention between Russia and the United States in terms of Russia's placing on that list. I think Russia's been very hesitant to do a lot of the things that the U.S. would like to see done, funding victim services, that kind of thing. But on law enforcement, which is what I focus on in terms of how do you deal with how do countries and places and people deal with trafficking. It really I think the TIP report actually does give Russia credit for their progress on law enforcement. I think where the TIP report tends to be at odds with Russia has to do more with prevention measures that Russia is taking to prevent trafficking, as well as protection measures for victims. You probably know that the only trafficking shelter for trafficking victims was closed in 2009, and it was a foreign-funded project from the International Organization for Migration. I just read a couple days ago, actually, that they're about to open a new shelter in St. Petersburg for victims of slave labor, which will also be open to victims of sex trafficking. So that was really exciting news, and it's also being done by not foreign governments, but it's being done by the Red Cross in Russia. And so I think the Russian reluctance to become involved in funding victim services has been what the U.S. has taken most issue with. On the other hand, in Russia, there's a lot of concern about why there should be particular services and particular special treatment for this kind of victim versus victims of crime more generally, and I think that's a fair point. And so there's a lot going on in trying to figure out what to do with trafficking victims. But in terms of law enforcement, I think that the U.S.'s the TIP report in particular has been very fair to law enforcement.
About the investigative tools. Again, 13 years ago, there was a lot of complaint about not having the resources for wiretaps or whatever. I'm wondering now that they're doing better economically, have the tools improved? Do they use wiretaps and pen registers? I don't know, whatever.
Yeah, they do, actually. Yeah, the money going to law enforcement over the past 10 years has been tremendous as an institution. And not just the MVD, but the investigative committee is a very, very well-resourced agency. And so they do a lot, and especially for the international cases. The domestic cases, they don't need to do this kind of stuff. They're low-level organized crime. They're pretty easy to, all things considered, they're pretty easy to bust. They're not as sophisticated as some of these international operations. But absolutely, the case that I studied most closely in Marielle was one in which they had the FSB was very involved. They had tons of wiretaps. They had a lot of video recording. They did a ton of preliminary investigative work before they even officially opened the case. And it was a slam dunk. It was really, really well executed. And the FSB has been involved in a lot of these cross-border cases, and so they bring their own resources to those kinds of investigations.
Liz in the back has a question.
Liz Lincoln, Ken Institute. I just had a question if you came across any cases where the police or law enforcement was one of the steps in the chain of getting kickbacks, looking the other way, and how prevalent that is. Thanks.
Absolutely, yes. Especially in the prostitution cases. There are very often deals with local law enforcement to turn a blind eye. Those are going to be deals that are either direct payment or in-kind payment with services of prostitutes, and that happens very frequently. There are also, and not always, in some of these cases, the law enforcement agent then becomes part of the case and is prosecuted as part of the case, and sometimes they're not. To buy a Krisha, to buy protection from local law enforcement is actually really expensive. And I've seen media reports, it's $10,000 a month. It's not cheap. So there have been a number of cases in which law enforcement have been involved. There's also been cases as a sheltering device. There's also been cases where law enforcement has been very directly involved. And there was one where the transportation police actually pulled migrants off the train and then sold them, took away their documents and then sold them. There was another case where a military intelligence colonel was involved in a huge international trafficking operation. He was still active military intelligence member. I make special note actually of these in my database, but it's hard to know how I wouldn't say that the level of corruption in trafficking cases is going to be any different than any other kinds of illicit activity. So I would presume that there's going to be similar amounts of corruption in drug deals, in arms deals, illegal guns, that kind of thing, as there is in prostitution and sex trafficking in particular, and also slave labor.
Any last questions? Well, if not, I'd like to thank Lauren for an excellent presentation and remind you that Lauren will be back again tomorrow. And I hope as many of you as possible can attend our workshop, our seminar on engaging the law in Eurasia and Eastern Europe tomorrow. Anyway, thank you very much, and thank you for your questions.
Thank you. Hit 35 right on the dot.
Did.
That was really
Did
impressive.
indeed. Did indeed.
I was kind of surprised, actually. I thought for sure it was going to go over. Thank you, Joe.